Today's podcast is dealing with a person who's telling their story about how they survived after being sexually abused as a child. Sexual abuse and abuse of any kind is something we don't talk about very often. And many are survivors and are wondering how they're going to put the pieces back together. Some have carried it with them all their lives and never talked about it. Some have told people who don't understand. Some are looking for answers. But any type of abuse that you suffer impacts the rest of your life and can affect who you are. But it also makes you resilient and allows you to figure out how to overcome. Reverend Dr. Karen Ruth Schaefer is going to tell her story today about how abuse impacted her life and continues to impact her life, but how she's able to have picked up the pieces and to move forward. Listen in and maybe you'll relate to this and you'll be able to share back or reply back with some comments, because this discussion needs to happen and needs to continue. Dr. Karen Ruth Schaefer's story right now.
Talk about healing. What comes to mind to you?
Well, I think that the beginning of my healing journey, as far as my awareness of early trauma, early injury, has affected my life ever since I was 4 years old. And so it seems that the learning that I did through early trauma has led me into needing to do a lot of unlearning and relearning in order to regain health.
So you say it started at age 4.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share what happened at age 4, or what it was that impacted you that you feel has changed you starting at that time?
The earliest memory that I have of sexual assault happened when I was 4, and I was I've done a lot of work on it just to be able to talk about it without it being just too difficult to talk about. But I'm trying to monitor and not share in a way that would be hurtful to other people in my life, but also just to share my story without getting into other people's stories. And to do that, I think it's, I can share that I was playing at a neighbor's house, a very close friend of mine and we played together almost every day. And we were very close friends. She and I went to the outhouse together, and there was no paper in the outhouse. So she went inside the house to get paper. And when she did, a man came in and locked me in and would not allow her back in and assaulted me. So that changed me, and the way the people around me responded to the changes in me, because I had no words to describe, so I was acting out. And so the way people responded even later in life, when I got old enough to try and tell the caregivers in my life what had happened, they didn't know how to respond and take care of me. So that early trauma shaped me into being anxious and fearful and having to really struggle to live into my own potential.
And did the person that assaulted you did they have consequences?
Well, it was years before I told anybody what happened.
Okay.
And even then, I still didn't have the words. We were part of a very, I would say, semi-insular, fairly insular religious group, and we were also very rural. So this was an era when there was no instruction of young children on good touch and bad touch and who to tell and what to tell and how to tell. That none of that existed at the time. So they just coping with it. And looking back, I really have no way of knowing what my parents thought or what they suspected or didn't suspect. I just know that as far as I'm aware, nobody did anything to, well, even I think it was about 10 or 11 when I finally told my mother, driving down the road one day in our big old family station wagon that would fit all of them, of the several children of us, just my mom and I on a rare occasion when she and I were alone. And I had worked up the courage and thought through what I would say to her. And what I had done is I had put a note underneath her pillow, and I named it rape because I had learned that word. And I told her just in a short note that I snuck underneath her pillow. And so when I was on that ride with her to go somewhere, I don't really remember where, but I asked her, did you find my note? And her response was very abrupt and curt. I found it. I talked to your dad about it. He said it was just kids playing. Don't worry about it. And then she changed the subject. And that was the entirety of what was done to communicate with me about what I had expressed.
Wow.
So can I ask you, what did that do to your relationship with your mom? Like with her response, how did, and how did that affect you in your relationship with your mom?
At the time, I think that's a really good question. And it has affected it in different ways throughout each stage of my life. I think very early on, I learned to protect my mother from my truth because I saw how difficult it was for her. And eventually she started to say things to me about that implied to me that if something happened, she didn't directly tell me that it was my fault, but I learned to believe it was my fault because what she said to me is that when she was a child, that nothing ever happened to her because she always she stayed where she was told to stay, and she avoided being around people who were like that. So even though it didn't happen in the context of an actual conversation to process what had happened, I internalized it as a response to that, because as she was trying to teach me and my siblings to stay in safe environments and to follow the instructions that they gave us around where our boundaries were. And I realized that, but what it communicated to me is that had I done the right thing, I would have been safe, and therefore it was my fault that it happened to me. And that's not her intention, but I'm not really answering your question about how it affected our relationship. A partial answer would be that I kept trying to get her to respond to my deep pain. I kept crying out to her. I kept getting up early when she had only a few minutes each day to have any peace with a cup of coffee after seeing my dad off to work, and then she would have a few minutes just to have a cup of coffee before scads of children were up clamoring for attention. I would get up early so that I could have that time with her, and she would just try her best to get rid of me so she could have her peace. As an adult, I understand that, but the relationship was that I was trying so hard to get something from her that she didn't understand or wasn't able to provide for me.
So I'm trying to understand, was this person part of that community? Is that why it seemed like there was sort of a resistance to accepting what you said was the perpetrator part of this close-knit community?
I didn't know who it was. I could describe the person. I knew what the person looked like, but I didn't know the person. So I don't know if it was someone who was visiting the neighbors. I didn't know if because the description fits other people in my life who could potentially have been there, but I never, because of how my mind responded to the trauma and kind of went away temporarily. Afterwards, I remember this person putting me on his shoulders and carrying me back to my home and telling me something like, if you tell anybody, I'll hurt your mother, or this would kill your mother, or something like that. So while there are 2 or 3 people or 2 or 3 possibilities who I think it might be, I couldn't identify a perpetrator because I didn't know. I knew from the details of the situation, though, that it was not young children. I knew the difference between other 4-year-olds playing doctor and an adult, or at least an older adolescent male who was the height of that person. I knew the difference between that. I knew that this was something way different than that.
So you tried to, when you did try to talk to your mom, she just shut that down. And so you had to deal with that for a number of years, or were you ever able to have that conversation where you were able to open up, and did she ever acknowledge what you were sharing? Has she at any time ever acknowledged that?
She has, as an adult, I finally, other than that time when I was maybe 10, 11, when we were riding together after I had put the note in under her pillow, I did not bring that back up with her until I was an adult. But I did a lot of screaming and yelling and crying and pleading for help at different times during my pre-adolescence and early adolescence. That were my attempts to try and get her to help me deal with the pain, and to try to get my dad to help me deal with the pain. I never talked with my dad about it, ever. But there was such, in our religious upbringing, there was definitely, it was forbidden to talk across genders about issues of sexuality or anything like that. It was just forbidden to do. So women could talk with other women, but women could not talk with men about those matters. So that was not a conversation I ever had with my dad, although he is definitely equally responsible to be my caregiver, obviously. Yeah, I kind of lost track of what your question was there. I'm sorry.
No, I was just wondering if your mother ever acknowledged what you went through, or if you never did resolve that with your mom to be able to, for her to accept or acknowledge your truth.
Partially. When I was, I think in my late 40s, I was on the phone with my mother, and just having a regular conversation with her, touching base on family and so forth. And one of our dogs, a beautiful mixed breed, dark lab, mostly lab dog that we love so much, actually somehow while we were on the phone got out the door and ran into the road and was hit. Now, a neighbor came into the house to tell me that my lab had been hit, and I just dropped the phone and ran out. And in that time of trauma, of dealing with that, when I got back to the phone to finish that conversation with my mom, I just said to her, I'm going to tell you some things, and I'm in a state of mind right now where I need you to just be quiet and just hear what I'm going to say. I don't want you to argue with me. I don't want you to tell me I'm not telling the truth, because I've just been re-traumatized and it's opened this up. And I need to say some things to you that I know are going to be uncomfortable. I just need you to listen. This happened to me. I told you, this is how you responded. It has affected my life ever since, and I need you to know that. And so I told her, and she did listen. And her response was, I would say a soft response in terms of her tone, but it was still that she wished that I had not gone there. So, you know, I haven't gone back there with her again. She's 90 years old now. She is, and my thought is that she's been a very loving mother. She has been responsible and taken good care of us. And this was just something that she did not have the capacity to deal with. I suspect that, knowing what she went through in her childhood, becoming an orphan at her mother became a single parent of a house full of young children when my mother was very young. My grandfather died of TB in a sanitarium. And my mother had a very rough childhood. And I suspect that a lot of things happened to her that she has not processed herself. So I just take responsibility for loving her with her limitation on being able to help me with this. And that was the first time I remember sexual assault. And there were numerous times after that with people who I do know who it was, and I do remember. But that first one was the one that caused me to become so different, because I was such an outgoing and verbal and joyous and creative little person. And that's still within me, but there's also that realization that every time I express that joy of just being who I am and enjoying being who I am, my fear is that in the next moment I'm going to come under attack, because that's been my life experience, that quite often those who have hatred toward girls and women cannot stand for us to be free and strong and joyful.
I'm assuming that since you were a school psychologist, that you have sought professional counseling for this.
Oh, yes.
Has that been helpful to you at all? How has that helped you to deal with the reality and the trauma of your childhood? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I've been through multiple types of therapy over the course of my lifetime, and go back to therapy when I see that my own wounds are affecting my ability to be in healthy relationships with other people. And so the healing that I've gotten is so significant that I've gone from, in my early adulthood, I actually, as a result, I followed the trajectory that is so common among girls who are traumatized and do not receive the supports that we need to heal. I followed that trajectory and ended up very young in a very abusive marriage, and ended up homeless, traumatized again, beaten, battered, very impoverished, cut off from family and friends, and had to find the strength through my faith and through connecting with both professional help and also self-help groups to start the climb back out of that devastating place. So from my early 20s throughout my 30s, I was healing and recovering and learning how to live a healthy adult life. And then throughout the decades following that, I have, for the most part, lived a healthy, productive life and have been able to be in very good, strong relationships for the most part, but it has affected some of my relationships in negative ways, and I've had to work at it a lot. And the people that I'm in relationship with have to work at it a lot with me, unfortunately.
Are there triggers that you see in yourself, that you see in your relationships, that say, you said when you are entering those stages in your relationship, that you seek out counseling? That's definitely paraphrasing what you just said, poorly paraphrasing what you just said. Are there triggers that you see in yourself that say, this has reemerged, this trauma has reemerged in my life, and I need to talk with somebody?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I start responding to challenging situations in life with by taking on negative definitions of myself, or allowing other people to define who I am by saying you are this, and whatever this is something negative. When I see myself tending to believe those things about myself, when I know myself internally and who I actually am. And I guess an example would be, because I internalized that message of it's your fault, and if you stayed in your place, you wouldn't be hurt or harmed. And if you recognize that you don't belong, if you understand that going to other people's places, because I was at someone else's home, if you just will stay in your own home and realize that other people don't want you, these kinds of messages that I internalize as a result of it, when other people in my social circles begin to give me those messages that we don't want you, you don't belong here, everything bad that happens is your fault, I have a tendency to go ahead and accept that about myself, and I find myself withdrawing more and more and feeling less and less joy and more responsible for whatever pain other people are feeling. Those are the things that let me know that I'm getting triggered, that I am taking on those messages again, and I need to take another leap in my own growth by going back into a therapeutic relationship to grow. Yeah, and to choose to believe about myself that I'm just another flawed human being who have been through some traumas, and of course I'm going to make mistakes, but that doesn't make me a mistake.
So I love the fact that you kind of integrate some self-affirmations. That is what I hear. You kind of integrate some self-affirmations along the way when you kind of find yourself being triggered and thinking about the negative messages. You kind of change it around into a positive message for you. I absolutely love that. I have a question, because, as I hear you talk, and you talk about the way that things had impacted you and some of the thoughts that you had, if I only would have stayed in a safe place or what have you. Do you find, or did you find that impacted the way that you interacted with your children, as far as allowing them to go visit people or go into other places with, outside of your site?
Oh my goodness. The crashing of my boundaries led me to have, if you talk with my children, tell you we had safe words, we had a million times me asking them too many times about what was happening with them anytime I wasn't there with them, just needing to have constant reassurance that things were okay. Because we were in pretty dire poverty when my children were very young, it placed us in vulnerable situations multiple times. And there were times when it was very hard to keep my children in a situation where I could be assured that the people with them were safe for them, and at the same time be working to get us out of poverty. So it was a challenge. And I tended to surround myself with other women who were hypervigilant in watching over their children so that we could watch over each other's children together. And yeah, my daughters, who are now in their early 40s, understand the reason why I was so hypervigilant with them. But when they got to be in their preteen years, they would tell me, "Okay, Mom, we get it. We'll tell you. Don't worry."
So your children are aware of the trauma that you went through?
Yes, to a point. They know that I went through trauma. They know that it was sexual trauma. They know I've been through physical trauma, and they know about my struggles to maintain good mental health and to be on a path toward growth and better health. And they themselves, because of living through with me their early childhood when we were really struggling, they themselves have gone through things that we shared. And so we work as a family, and we've been in family therapy, and we have a goal in our family to get better in each generation, because these things are intergenerational, and to try and pretend that they're not, and that my wounds didn't hurt my children, would be putting my head in the sand, which is essentially what my parents wanted to do. I believe that their trauma and their childhood led them both to want to be in denial, very, very strong denial, and just not deal with things. So quite often my siblings and I would find ourselves needing to help each other deal with things. And we were children, so we certainly weren't equipped to do that. And I don't think that that's something that is outside of the ordinary. I think that we as a culture as a whole have a lot to do in terms of learning how to support and help each new generation learn how to live lives that are healthy and to provide safe environments for our children. That's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about empowering education work, just to make sure that we're learning together as a culture, and we're creating the environment in which families can thrive and can deal with these things and get stronger.
Wonder, and I'm not sure how to ask this question, because when I think about that, you're someone who has 2 masters, you're an ordained elder in the AME Church, and you have a doctorate degree. What inside of you gave yourself the strength to overcome that? And I'm maybe not answering the question very well, asking the question very well. But what's the key that you see that gave you the drive to say, I can, and to succeed in the areas that you have? Does that make sense?
I think that's a very thoughtful question. And it has to do with multiple things. The fact that these traumas happened during my childhood and into my early adulthood, and that as I grew, I began to participate in self-sabotage and behaviors that were contributing to my own struggles. Those things happen in a context with a lot of other positive things that were happening. So I was being taught a very solid spiritual path, in a sense. I had access to sacred texts that connected me to a faith that was beyond what I was being taught. I had access to texts that allowed me to read things like, if you know the truth will set you free. And I understood that a lot of what I was being taught couldn't possibly be true because it was putting me in bondage instead of freedom. So I made a commitment to seek the truth. And I also was in an environment where, while there were plenty of people telling me that women were not to be educated and that education made women crazy, I also had access to phenomenal teachers who just fed my hunger for learning. And I was deeply loved and cherished. The traumas didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened in a context of a big, large, extended family who loved me, even though I was a lot of times not very easy to love because of my reaction to my trauma. So that's a long-winded answer, I know, but I think the bottom line, it really is a reason why I think I've really connected with Katrina's research around strength and resilience, and how coming through trauma and surviving it and then learning how to thrive and become healthier and be on this growth trajectory comes because we have access to other things in our life besides just the trauma. And I think a mistake that my culture that I grew up in, including my family culture, a big mistake was to try and have us only focus on what's positive and strong and never even deal with if anything happens that doesn't fit within that bubble, that we just try to pretend like it didn't happen. That's the mistake. But all of those other strengths and positive aspects that I grew with that's the answer to your question, is that is what saved me. And it really was access to being able to have a relationship with God, to be able to have a commitment to say, no matter what happens to me, I understand that the highest value is love, because that's what has been ingrained in me since a young age. And therefore, I'm going to love no matter what. I'm going to ask God to help me love no matter what.
So you said something that I felt was very key. You said that your traumas did not happen in a vacuum. And I think a lot of times people forget that traumas do not happen in a vacuum. Things that happen to us do not happen, all separate and apart from ourselves. We may not see it. People may not see it all the time, see it happening and seeing it transpire, but it's happening. And I think that that's one of the key things to remember. I do have a question though, because just thinking about all of this, I'm still trying to wrap my brain around your story. But with the community that you grew up in, was anything like this likely to happen? Like, was this something that, children talked about happening to them? Or did this actually appear to be or feel like an isolated event? If I'm asking my question correctly.
Yeah, it was common. It happened to some of my siblings, and it happened to a lot of the other children in that religious movement around us. Yeah.
So do you think, because I heard you say that you feel like your mom may not just have had the capacity to be able to provide you with the assistance that you needed, but do you think that it was also, I don't know, I mean, we all can't say, you know, what our parents think or feel or someone else thinks or feel, but I'm just kind of like thinking through this. Do you think that it was maybe also like she couldn't handle it and didn't know how to not necessarily give you the help, but how to respond? I don't even know how to respond to this myself. So I'm going to block this out. This never happened. You all were just playing. It didn't happen because maybe it was just too much for her to bear.
Yes. I absolutely think that. Yep. You made me think of a young woman. I almost identified her relationship to me, and I don't want to do that because I don't want to tell someone else's story in that way. But there's a young woman that has been close in my life who went through some very, very difficult things as a teenager and as a young child. And she came to me in a mentor capacity at one point when she was about 16 and just was wailing, saying that she'd gone to a school counselor and tried to tell the school counselor what was happening. And the counselor shut her down. And I was able to tell her, much like you just said to me, what you're describing is more than this counselor can bear. And this young girl at the time was just, are you telling me that I have to live something at my age that a full-grown woman can't even bear to hear? And I said, yes, that is what I'm telling you. And so that is right. That is accurate.
And that's hard. So sometimes that's the truth that of the matter, you know, that we have to deal with. And sometimes that is hard, like, because the people that are around us that's to love and care and protect us, they may not necessarily know how to do that. Like, I failed at protecting you, so I can't even think about that this horrible thing has happened because I couldn't protect you in that moment. And that has done something to me as an individual. Not to diminish, you know, the experience, but I'm experiencing this too because now I'm traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes back to that statement: the traumas do not happen in a vacuum, because what happens to one individual also happens to someone else. Those people that are around them are affected too.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you also mentioned that this seemed to go on in the community that you were in. So there were victims who were all forced to, so to speak, stay silent. Mm-hmm. And there were perpetrators who were able to offend and reoffend and get away with it.
Yes.
So how did that affect you? Or did that push you out of that environment as soon as you were able to get out of it? Did you get out of it?
Yes, I got out of it as soon as I could. And I was ill-equipped for adult life, to say the least. So I had I had to learn how to survive. There are some really kind of funny things that happened because I wasn't prepared to be in a more urban setting, an urban community. There were just so many things that seem so basic and common and ordinary now that I didn't understand and didn't know anything about. And I think that part of the reason why so much perpetration of sexual abuse and emotional and psychological, physical abuse even, that happened within our community was because of the naivete and because it was an insular community. It's interesting because people had people were skilled. They had technical skills. They had um, abilities and were intelligent and all of that. It wasn't that people weren't knowledgeable about things, but there was a certain naivete about, um, I think about evil and wickedness and how people who have an intention to perpetrate the wolves in sheep's clothing had very little difficulty coming into our community because the people were so, I think about my mom and dad, and even though they had been through so many rough times, they were so open and loving and so welcoming of people into the community, which we want to be that way. And yet at the same time, to have those boundaries in place. And I mean, yes, you definitely have to get your background checks. You're not coming anywhere near any of our children without your background checks. And yes, you do have to have multiple adults present in every situation where there are children there. And yes, you do have to keep the doors open and have windows anytime that you're in the group. Absolutely, because we understand that there are perpetrators out there and they're looking for vulnerable populations to prey on. But my parents didn't, and the other adults who were safe adults in our environment didn't protect us. And I think they didn't have at least they didn't accept the reality. It's very odd because the same people who came through war times and knew there was evil in this world, they had to know there was evil in this world. And yet they would welcome people in to be choir directors with young people who would then be taking young people home with them and assaulting them. Well, I'm calling it assault, but they were grooming and taking young people home with them. It's just sickening. It feels very uncomfortable for me to talk about this publicly because I've been definitely conditioned not to, but we have to speak, and more people from these communities are speaking out, and I'm one of them.
You know, and this can be edited out, so I'm going to go ahead and say it. That's one of my concerns about the direction that we're going as a nation these days, is because we are moving back to a period that, in a mindset that says, women, you're second-class citizens. You're not supposed to be thinking. You're not supposed to be, how dare you be doctors? How dare you be educated? How dare you be pastors? Deal with whatever it is we want to give you as men. I said, and that's a side note that I know can be edited out. So, but yeah, that's one of my concerns about the direction that we seem to be heading right now.
And I don't necessarily think it needs to be edited out because it goes back to that idea that we're all interconnected. And what happens at the international scale, at the national scale, at the larger system scale really does affect what happens in families and in smaller communities and to individuals. So I think we do have to be thinking about how telling our individual stories is important. I actually recently was talking with a woman who seemed to not be aware that there are things that happen to women, girls and women, and also, let's be real, it happens to boys and men also. The siblings that I'm speaking of, the cousins, the close friends in my growing up community were boys and girls, and the pain of it impacted all of us, and each of us in different ways. So I think that it's power, it's misuse of power, and the reality is that men have had more power in our communities. So therefore, when there's abuse of power, it does tend to more frequently be enacted against women by men, but that's not exclusive. I think that finding the maybe courage isn't the right word, but just forcing myself to feel the anxiety about putting even a small portion of my story out there, is because I know I'm not alone. I know that a huge percentage of people in our population have gone through similar or different, but equally as painful traumas. And it's because of abuse of power. And it's because of entire communities of people sticking their head in the sand instead of coming together with an agreement that we're not going to allow there to be abuse of power that harms another generation of children. And right now, we're seeing war being waged, huge scale abuse of power. And I think I can speak for myself. I can't speak for every person who's been through abuse of power at an individual small scale. But for me, seeing that abuse of power at this large scale, I recognize that individuals, families, and communities are being traumatized right now by abuse of power. And if we can, by telling our stories, give other people the courage to say, how can we band together and stand up against abuse of power, then it would be worth it forcing myself to do it.
Amen. Amen.
And that's so true, because if we don't speak up and others don't speak up, people begin to think that silence is the only way to deal with this. Because people, as in your community, if we know what's going on, but if we don't talk about it, we can pretend it doesn't exist and keep putting off the message that we're this perfect Christian community that protects and loves everybody and accepts everybody regardless of what you do and who you are.
Yeah.
Even when you make our people victims, we're still going to embrace you and we're going to cover it up and pretend it doesn't occur, because we want to convey the message that we're all this wonderful people. And we have to start being honest and saying that there are, like, as you said so aptly, I think wolves in sheep's clothing. I was going to get it backwards. There are wolves in sheep's clothing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to let people know when this happens, if the people in your community are not listening, find a person outside of your community who will listen,
Mm-hmm.
and who will help you and who will support you. Because sometimes our communities are not doing that. And it's whether it's a cover up, whether it's a safety mechanism, whether it's to present a false image to make us look better than we are and try and make us look like we're not flawed when all of us are flawed.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying what you are today. You know, this is something that we know goes on in communities and still goes on, that you have these groups and these churches and these organizations and these villages that just cover up and don't talk about what goes on. And the part that happens is sometimes those victims end up victimizing others because they have no other way to cope with their victimization because they were shut down.
And the truth tellers get punished. And I think that
Yeah.
leads to a huge amount of fear for those of us who, just because of who we are, our personalities, that we just keep screaming and saying, hey, y'all are going to listen to me because this did happen. And even if I don't have the words to say it, I'm going to scream, I'm hurting, please hear me. And that's what I did. I mean, it's very, in my public life, in my school life, I excelled as a student. And I was demonstrating the wounds by doing things like wear my coat all day in a 72 degree or 70 degree building because I was trying to cover up. I mean, there were signs of what had happened to me that an astute person who was versed in what to look for would have seen, but if someone did see it, they didn't respond by providing the help that I needed. Although, even as I say that, I realize that perhaps my high school, the counselor at my high school may have seen it and responded, because she signed me up for college and told me I was going, where I was going, when I was going, and who was picking me up to take me there, and who was picking me up to be my liaison with the college. And yes, my parents did support that, but they didn't do anything to promote it. That high school counselor got me there. So essentially, there was someone in my community who, whether she just saw potential in me and wanted that for that reason, or she saw that I needed her help, I'm not sure, or some combination of both. I'm very grateful, very grateful.
It'd be interesting to go back to her now as an adult, if she's still alive, and one, thank her if you haven't, but two, to ask her, what did you see? What did you see in me that you took the extra step? Because I'm sure she didn't do that with every child in high school. That you selected me out of the group of how many other students were in your high school. And that it was me that you helped move forward. What did you see?
I just realized, and I completely had forgotten, I did reach out to her when I was a freshman in high school. I did go to her and try to talk to her.
Okay.
I didn't tell her much, but I just as you were suggesting that I reach out to her, I realized that I did reach out to her. So I did reach out for help beyond my community, my insular community. Yeah.
And she was probably astute enough to know that there's something else under the surface here that she's not sharing. And so held to whomever that counselor was.
Mm-hmm.
We give her all the praise and honor.
Yeah.
Yeah, for doing that. So
yeah, I thank you, all of you, for listening to this portion of my story. It has left me with the ongoing need to be vigilant in terms of making sure that I'm neither refusing to see my own flaws and my own errors of my own ways and work on myself to get better, and also not allowing the breaking of my boundaries through no fault of my own to allow people to mistreat me, to continue to mistreat me, because I have had a tendency to do that, to not be able to recognize, no, I need to set a boundary here because this person is actually mistreating me. And sometimes I just allow people to mistreat me for a long period of time before I finally set a boundary. And that's something I need to continue to work on.
Well, I have to ask you the question we always ask. Are you healed?
Partly. And I'm a lot better than I used to be. And I'm really looking forward to the growth ahead.
are there any questions that we didn't ask that you think that we should have? Anything that you want to say?
Well, I just hope that we can continue, and as we do our webinars and continue to make video casts and podcasts as we move forward, that we can continue to share with each other and invite others to share with us, because I think this is an amazingly healing process, and I thank you for being involved in it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
You are strong and you have overcome. So that's a good thing.
Definitely. Continuing on with those affirmations, giving us all that encouragement and power, because there's power in our words, as you know. And continuing to bring forth those affirmations just make it that much more sweeter at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because it is a process. Healing is a process.
Yes, yes. And hopefully heal and to be a part of other people's healing as well. I'm so hopeful because a few years ago it was a struggle every day to be able to battle the tendency toward depression and anxiety. And now there are times when I have days on end where I'm mostly good, and that's great.
Amen.
Yeah, and the good thing is you see the signs and you know the signs.
Mhm.
And so you are there to help those who are looking for someone to help them.
Yeah.
I'm recording a short follow-up today because this morning I got up my nerve to finally have a conversation with my mother to make sure that well, not if, but when this video goes live, that should she hear it or see it, that she wouldn't be caught by surprise or be hurt by it. And it was such an amazing and wonderful conversation I ended up having with her. So healing, and I was amazed by it. I hope I'm going to be able to get through this because it's quite emotional. But what she said is, as long as you think that it will help someone else, go ahead and do it. She ended up telling me about what she was actually told that had happened to me and how she perceived it at the time. And she shared with me things that she indicated she had never shared with anyone else in her entire life. She's 90 years old. She told me things that she had held within her, which I told her it's confidential. I won't share it, but I did ask her, is it okay for me to do a little bit of a follow-up? I had to stop the recording for a little bit, but it just illustrates that these childhood traumas are multi-generational, and unless we tell our stories and really be intentional about supporting the next generation, that breaking the cycle is going to be more ongoing. So I'm so thankful for the conversation I was able to have with my mom today. And
as Karen shared in her story, trauma is not only an individual experience, but it can be collective. It can impact others that are connected to that individual. And at times, the pain from the trauma can be so deafening that it makes it hard to hear and accept the experience that's being shared. However, we must remember to get the help that we need in order to destroy the chains that binds us to the trauma so that they do not become generational. In order to live a productive life, we must remember, 1, to recognize our triggers, 2, to get the help that we need, 3, to revisit therapy as often as we need to, and 4, remember that healing is a process.